Why does that dog keep doing that? Mark Peterson wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, squinting at the golden retriever mix trotting down the cracked sidewalk of his sleepy little town in Missouri. The dog had been coming around every evening for weeks, always carrying something in its mouth, sometimes scraps of meat, sometimes a whole sandwich. It would cross Main Street, slip through a narrow alleyway behind the old hardware store, and disappear into the woods beyond. Mark had seen a lot in his 38 years, growing up in the same house his parents once owned, taking over the family business when his dad retired, and watching the town slowly shrink as people moved away for bigger opportunities. But this was something new. He leaned against the counter of his bait and tackle shop, watching as the dog, thin but not sickly, carried what looked like a half-eaten burger in its jaws. "Where does he even get this food?" Mark muttered, mostly to himself. Old Joe, a retired fisherman who spent more time in the shop talking than actually buying anything, chuckled from his usual spot near the minnow tank. "That's just Buddy," he said, rubbing his white beard. "Ain't got no owner, but he don't go hungry. People around here like him." "Yeah, but—" Mark hesitated. "He takes it somewhere. Every time." Joe raised an eyebrow. "And that's got you curious? Wouldn't you be?" Joe shrugged. "I'd be more curious why a man your age has got nothing better to do than spy on a stray." Mark laughed under his breath, shaking his head. "Maybe I just like a good mystery." He decided that night he would follow Buddy. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples, Mark locked up the shop and waited. Sure enough, right on schedule, Buddy trotted out from behind the diner, a small plastic-wrapped sandwich clamped between his teeth. Mark followed at a distance, keeping to the shadows, his boots silent against the pavement. The dog moved with purpose, weaving between parked cars, cutting through backyards, avoiding the roads where too many people might notice. Mark had expected him to stop at a junk pile, or maybe bury his food somewhere, but Buddy pressed on, disappearing past the outskirts of town and into the dense woodland beyond. Mark hesitated at the tree line. He wasn't a fan of going into the woods alone at night, but something in him, some deep, gnawing curiosity, urged him forward. The path was uneven, tangled with roots, but Buddy navigated it easily. Mark did his best to keep up, his breath steady, ears alert for any unusual sounds. Crickets chirped in the distance, and an owl hooted somewhere overhead. Then he heard something else. A sound barely louder than the rustling leaves. A whimper. Mark stopped, listening. Buddy had vanished into a thicket, but the faint sound of small, muffled cries reached his ears. He pushed through the branches, thorns scratching at his arms. And then, in the clearing ahead, he saw it. A small makeshift shelter, barely more than a few pieces of wood and a tarp. Inside, huddled together on a pile of blankets, were 3 children. Mark's breath caught in his throat. They were young, maybe 4 or 5 at most, their clothes dirty, faces smudged with grime. They clung to one another, their wide eyes reflecting fear and exhaustion. And Buddy, the stray who had puzzled him for weeks, was nudging the sandwich toward them, his tail wagging softly. Mark took a slow step forward, careful not to startle them. "Hey," he said gently. "It's okay. You don't have to be afraid." The smallest child, a little girl with curly blonde hair, clutched Buddy's fur. She didn't speak, but her eyes stayed locked on Mark, wary but curious. Mark's heart pounded. Who were they? How had they ended up here, and why had no one noticed? He crouched down, keeping his voice steady. "My name's Mark. I live in town, not far from here." He hesitated before adding, Are you hungry? The boy, who looked to be the oldest, nodded hesitantly. Mark reached into his pocket, pulling out a protein bar he'd grabbed from the shop earlier. He unwrapped it slowly, setting it down near the edge of the shelter. Buddy gave him a look, one that almost seemed to say, "Good. Now do more." Mark exhaled. This wasn't just some mystery anymore. These kids needed help. And somehow, against all odds, a stray dog had been the one to keep them alive. Mark sat back on his heels, his mind racing. He needed to think, to figure out how to get them somewhere safe without scaring them off. But one thing was clear. He wasn't leaving them here. And neither was Buddy. Mark took a deep breath, willing himself to stay calm as he sat just outside the makeshift shelter. The kids were still watching him with uncertainty, their small bodies curled into the blankets Buddy had led them to. The dog stood beside them, protective but not aggressive, his tail wagging softly as if reassuring them that Mark meant no harm. He needed to think. Rushing them wasn't an option. He'd already seen the way their eyes darted toward the woods as if expecting to run. If he made one wrong move, they could bolt, and he had no idea where they'd go or how long they'd last on their own. The only reason they'd survived this long was because of Buddy. Mark reached slowly into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small flashlight. He kept it low, not wanting to blind them, and shone it just enough to get a better look at their faces. The boy was probably around 7 or 8, with short, light brown hair and wary eyes. The middle child, a girl, looked to be 5 or 6, clutching the little one's hand as if she were her lifeline. And the youngest, the blonde-haired toddler, couldn't be older than 3. They were all thin, not skeletal, but thinner than kids should be. Mark glanced at the sandwich Buddy had brought. It had been carefully split into pieces, meaning the kids had learned how to make every bite stretch. He swallowed hard. "You all been out here long?" he asked, keeping his voice steady and soft. No answer. The little girl buried her face against Buddy's side, and the older boy stiffened. Mark realized then that they must have been hiding for a reason. Someone had left them, or worse, someone had been looking for them. If they'd been abandoned, they'd be scared of strangers. If they were running from something, that was even worse. He sat back on his heels. "I won't make you go anywhere you don't want to," he said after a long pause. "But I can get you more food, some clean clothes, maybe a warm place to stay." The boy's jaw clenched. "We're fine," he muttered, barely above a whisper. Mark exhaled. Stubborn, protective. That meant he'd been the one trying to take care of them. He respected that, but there was no way 3 kids could last much longer like this. "You know," Mark said, shifting the conversation, "I've been seeing Buddy bring food out here for a while now. I figured he had a hiding spot, maybe a stash or something. Turns out he's got people." Buddy wagged his tail, as if agreeing. The boy didn't respond, but Mark could see the conflict in his eyes. He was trying to decide if he should trust him. Mark reached for his phone, holding it up so they could see. "How about this? I won't call nobody, won't make you do anything. I'll just go to the diner, pick up some extra food, bring it back here. You don't even have to talk to me. Just eat." The boy's lips parted like he was going to protest, but then he closed them again. After a long pause, he gave the smallest nod. Mark took that as his cue. He stood up, stretching his stiff legs. "I'll be back soon," he promised, keeping his movements slow. He didn't want to spook them. "Buddy, you watch over them, all right?" Buddy thumped his tail against the ground like he understood. Mark made his way back through the trees, his mind racing. As soon as he was far enough from the clearing, he broke into a light jog. The diner was still open when he got to town, and he slipped inside. the bell above the door jingling as he stepped in. Mary, the owner, looked up from behind the counter and smiled. "Evening, Mark. You're out late." "Yeah, just grabbing some takeout." She wiped her hands on a rag. "Got any requests, or should I surprise you?" He hesitated. He needed food that kids would eat, nothing too fancy or unfamiliar. "A few grilled cheese sandwiches, some soup if you got it, and a couple extra burgers." Mary narrowed her eyes. "That's a lot of food for one man." Mark forced a chuckle. "Yeah, well, I got a hungry guest." She didn't press the issue, but he could tell she wanted to. Luckily, she was more interested in getting the order done than asking questions. While he waited, he pulled out his phone, debating. He could call the sheriff, but if those kids were running from someone, that might only scare them off. He needed to gain their trust first. When the food was ready, he paid and hurried out, his breath visible in the cool night air. He walked quickly, glancing at the bag in his hands. It smelled incredible, and he was willing to bet those kids hadn't had a hot meal in a long time. By the time he got back to the clearing, Buddy was waiting for him. The kids were still in their shelter, but he could see their heads peeking out, watching carefully. "Brought you some food," Mark said, setting the bag down just outside their shelter. "No strings, no rules, just eat." The boy hesitated, then slowly, cautiously, crawled forward and grabbed the bag. He backed up just as quickly, as if he expected Mark to snatch him. Mark didn't move. He just sat there and watched as they unwrapped the food. The younger girl's eyes widened when she saw the grilled cheese, and she grabbed one immediately, stuffing a bite into her mouth. The boy, still suspicious, checked everything before he let them eat. Mark stayed silent, letting them have their space. Buddy settled beside him, leaning against his leg. Minutes passed, and finally the boy spoke. "Her name's Lily," he said, nodding toward the little one. "She's 3. Mark nodded. "And you?" He hesitated. "I'm Jack. That's my sister, Emily." "Well, Jack, it's nice to meet you." Jack didn't say anything to that, but he didn't shut down either. That was progress. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I meant what I said. I won't make you do anything you don't want. But you don't have to live out here. There's a better way." Jack looked away, his jaw tightening. Mark didn't push. He just sat there, watching as the kids ate, feeling Buddy's warmth against him. He'd started the night with a mystery, but now he had something else. A responsibility. And he wasn't walking away. Mark leaned back against the trunk of a tree, feeling the coolness of the bark press against his jacket. The air was crisp, and the sounds of the woods settled into a rhythm around him, leaves shifting in the breeze, crickets chirping in the distance, and the quiet rustling of 3 children finishing a meal they probably hadn't expected to have. Jack still held himself stiffly, watching Mark like he was waiting for him to make the wrong move. Emily had relaxed slightly, still close to her brother, but nibbling at a second grilled cheese with a little less hesitation. Lily, the youngest, had leaned into Buddy's side, rubbing her small fingers over his fur as if she found comfort in his warmth. Mark let the silence stretch between them for a bit, giving them time to eat, to adjust. He knew pushing too hard would only make Jack dig in his heels. The kid was smart. Too smart for his age, really. He had the kind of sharpness that came from having to grow up too fast. And Mark had a feeling he was the one who had been keeping the 3 of them alive out here. "I used to camp out in these woods when I was your age," Mark said after a while, keeping his tone casual. "Me and my cousin would sneak out here, build a little shelter just like yours. We thought we were real survivalists." He let out a quiet chuckle. "Didn't take long before we ran out of food, though. Got so hungry we tried to catch fish with our hands. Ever tried that?" Jack didn't respond, but Emily's head lifted slightly, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Doesn't work," Mark continued, shaking his head. "Ended up going home, got grounded for sneaking out, and my dad made us eat a whole plate of vegetables before we could have anything else." He glanced at Jack then. "But you? You've been out here for a while, haven't you?" Jack swallowed the last bite of his sandwich and wiped his hands on his pants. "We do fine." Mark didn't argue. "I can see that. You've been looking after them." Jack's jaw tightened. "I'm supposed to." Mark could feel the weight in those words. Whatever had happened to them, Jack had taken it upon himself to be responsible for his sisters. That wasn't something a kid should have to do, but Mark wasn't going to tell him that. He'd already made up his mind to keep them safe. What he needed was for them to trust him enough to let him help. He glanced at the shelter again. It was sturdy for something built out of scavenged wood and a tarp, but it wasn't enough, not with colder nights coming in. They wouldn't last much longer like this. And then there was the bigger question. How had they ended up here in the first place? Mark didn't ask, not yet. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small bag of beef jerky. He opened it and held it out to Buddy, who sniffed it before taking a piece and chewing happily. "Buddy's been taking care of you, huh?" Emily nodded, her fingers curling in the dog's fur. "He brings food." "Good dog," Mark murmured, scratching behind Buddy's ear. Then he looked at Jack. "And you? You been getting food for them too?" Jack hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Sometimes." Mark figured that meant digging through dumpsters or taking whatever was left out behind restaurants. He knew the town well enough to guess where they might have been getting by. Still, that wasn't a long-term solution. "I know you don't trust me yet," Mark said, his voice even, "but I don't want anything from you. I just want to help." Jack stared at him for a long time, considering, weighing his options. "Why?" Mark exhaled, glancing up at the night sky through the gaps in the trees. "Because someone helped me once." Jack's brows pulled together slightly. He wasn't expecting that answer. Mark let out a slow breath. "When I was about your age, things weren't so great at home. My mom got sick, and my dad... Well, let's just say he wasn't much help. For a while it was just me figuring things out on my own. I got lucky. Someone stepped in, made sure I had food, a safe place to be. They didn't have to. They just did." He met Jack's gaze. "Sometimes people do things just because it's the right thing to do." Jack looked away, scuffing his shoe against the dirt. "We don't need saving." "I know," Mark said simply. "But you could probably use a little help." Jack didn't respond, but he didn't argue either. That was something. Mark pushed himself to his feet, stretching out his legs. "All right, here's the deal. I'll be back tomorrow with more food. If you need anything, blankets, warmer clothes, you tell me." Jack eyed him. "And if we don't?" Mark shrugged. "Then I'll bring extra anyway. Not gonna let you freeze out here." Jack studied him again, that sharp, assessing gaze. Then, after what felt like forever, he gave the smallest nod. Mark felt a quiet relief settle over him. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a start. He took a step back. "I'll see you tomorrow, then." Buddy wagged his tail, as if sealing the agreement. Mark turned and walked away, forcing himself not to look back. He wanted to make sure they stayed put, that they ate every last bite of the food, but he knew trust had to be earned. If he was going to get those kids somewhere safe, he had to do it on their terms. As he reached the edge of the woods, the town lights glowing faintly in the distance, he let out a breath. He had no idea what he was getting himself into. But he wasn't walking away. Mark didn't sleep much that night. Even after he'd locked up the shop and settled into his worn-out recliner with the TV playing low in the background, his mind kept circling back to the kids in the woods. Jack, Emily, Lily. 3 kids, hiding in the cold, relying on a stray dog to bring them scraps. It didn't sit right. Nothing about it did. He thought about calling someone, child services, the sheriff, but something in his gut told him that wouldn't be the right move. Not yet. He had no idea what those kids had been through, or who they might be running from. The last thing he wanted was to scare them into disappearing deeper into the woods. By morning, he had a plan. He'd bring them supplies, just like he promised. But this time, he'd dig a little deeper, try to figure out what their situation was and what they needed most. Food, clothes, and warmth were a start, but they needed more than that. They needed safety. He packed a bag before heading out, extra sandwiches from the diner, a few bottles of water, and a couple of old hoodies he'd dug up from his closet. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He also grabbed a flashlight, just in case, and a few granola bars he had lying around the shop. By the time he got back to the woods, Buddy was waiting for him, tail wagging. The dog trotted up as Mark knelt down, giving him a good scratch behind the ears. "Good boy," Mark murmured. "You're looking out for them, huh?" Buddy wagged his tail harder, then turned and led Mark toward the clearing. The kids were where he'd left them, still curled up under their makeshift shelter. Jack was the first to spot him, straightening up with that wary look in his eyes. Emily clutched Lily closer, watching carefully. Mark stopped a few feet away, holding up the bag. "Brought some things. Thought you might need 'em." Jack hesitated before giving a small nod. "Thanks." Mark took that as permission and set the bag down. He stepped back, giving them space as Jack crawled forward, rifling through the supplies. He pulled out a hoodie first, looking it over before glancing at Mark. "Figured it might help with the cold," Mark said, crossing his arms. Jack didn't say anything, but he handed it to Emily, who pulled it over her small frame. It swallowed her, but she looked warmer. She even managed a small smile. Lily, still clutching Buddy's fur, reached for one of the granola bars. Jack unwrapped it for her before she could struggle with the packaging, then watched as she took small bites. Mark let the moment settle before he spoke again. "Been out here long?" Jack stiffened slightly, but he didn't shut down completely. "A while." Mark nodded, not pushing. "You got anyone looking for you?" Jack's gaze flickered. That was all the answer Mark needed. He sighed, crouching down so he was closer to their level. "Listen, I'm not here to make you do anything. But I need to know, are you in trouble?" Jack hesitated, his fingers curling into the hoodie he was now wearing. "We're fine." Mark studied him, the way his shoulders tensed, the way his jaw clenched. This kid had been carrying too much weight for too long. "You got parents?" Mark asked, his voice softer now. Jack hesitated again, then shook his head. "Not anymore." Something heavy settled in Mark's chest. "I'm sorry, kid." Jack didn't say anything, but Emily sniffled, pressing closer to him. Lily, unaware of the tension, kept nibbling on her granola bar, still half leaning against Buddy. Mark ran a hand over his jaw. "All right," he said finally. "Here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna keep bringing you food and whatever else you need, but you gotta promise me something." Jack eyed him warily. "What?" "You don't disappear," Mark said firmly. "You stay put, right here. If you need something, you tell me. I don't care what it is." Jack chewed on the inside of his cheek before nodding. "Okay." It wasn't much, but it was something. Mark exhaled, glancing at Buddy. And you keep watching over them, yeah? Buddy thumped his tail against the ground. Mark stood, stretching out his legs. I'll be back tomorrow. Jack nodded again, but this time his posture wasn't quite as stiff. Emily even managed to meet his eyes before quickly looking away. Lily, completely at ease now, was playing with Buddy's ears. Mark took that as progress and turned to leave. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but he wasn't going to stop until those kids were safe. Mark spent the rest of the day thinking about the kids. Every time he tried to focus on something else, helping customers at the shop, restocking shelves, even flipping through the old newspaper on the counter, his mind kept drifting back to them. They had no parents, Jack had made that clear. But what he hadn't said was just as important. The way he hesitated before answering, the way his body stiffened. Something had happened, something that had left them alone in the woods with only a stray dog looking after them. By the time the shop closed, Mark had made up his mind. He needed to find out more. He wasn't calling the authorities, not yet, but he wasn't going to sit back and pretend this was normal. 3 kids didn't just show up in the woods for no reason. Someone had to have been looking for them at some point. He started with the diner. Mary was wiping down the counter when he walked in, the place nearly empty except for a couple of old-timers nursing cups of coffee. She glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "Twice in one day? What's got you roaming around town so much?" she asked. Mark slid onto a stool. "Got a question for you." She set her rag down, leaning on the counter. "Shoot. You heard about any missing kids around here?" Mary's forehead creased. "Missing?" "Yeah. Maybe not recently, but in the last few months. A family that might have dropped off the radar." She frowned, thinking. "Can't say I have. Most folks around here would be talking if something like that happened. You check with the sheriff?" Mark shook his head. "Not yet." Mary eyed him carefully. "You know something, don't you?" Mark hesitated. He trusted Mary, but he wasn't ready to tell anyone yet. "Just trying to piece something together." She gave him a long look before sighing. "Tell you what, I'll ask around, see if anyone remembers anything strange." Mark nodded. "Appreciate it." By the time he left, the sky had turned dark, the streetlights flickering on. He made his way back toward the woods, carrying another bag of food and a couple of blankets he'd grabbed from home. The air had gotten colder since the sun went down, and he didn't want the kids freezing out there. Buddy was waiting for him again at the tree line, tail wagging as he trotted up to greet him. Mark scratched behind his ears, then followed the dog back to the clearing. Jack was already awake, sitting outside the shelter with his arms wrapped around his knees. Emily was curled up inside, her head resting against Lily's. They looked warmer in the hoodies he'd given them, but it still wasn't enough. Mark dropped the bag beside Jack. "Got more food and blankets." Jack glanced at the bag before nodding. "Thanks." Mark sat down on the ground, stretching his legs out. "Mary at the diner doesn't remember any missing kids. Seems like people would have noticed if you'd been around town." Jack's shoulders tensed. "We weren't." Mark exhaled. "Where were you before this?" Jack didn't answer right away. He looked at Emily and Lily, his expression guarded, before turning back to Mark. "Different places." Mark wasn't surprised by the vague answer. "Were you with someone?" Jack's jaw tightened. "Not anymore." That told Mark enough. Whoever had been with them before, they weren't coming back. He didn't know if that meant something tragic or something dangerous, but either way, these kids were on their own now. Mark sighed, running a hand over his face. "Look, I know you don't trust me yet, and that's fine, but I need to know if you're safe, if someone's looking for you." Jack shook his head. No one's looking for us." There was something final in the way he said it. Mark studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right." He didn't push, even though a dozen questions burned in his mind. The last thing he wanted was to make Jack shut down completely. Instead, he leaned back on his hands. "You know, Buddy's a good dog. Smart, too." Emily lifted her head at that. "He saved us." Mark glanced at her. "Yeah." She nodded. "We didn't have food for a while. Then Buddy started bringing some. He stayed with us when it was cold." Mark looked at the dog, who wagged his tail proudly. "You're a hero, huh?" Buddy licked his hand, as if agreeing. Jack sighed, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "What happens now?" Mark hesitated. "That's up to you, kid." Jack frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm not forcing you to do anything, but if you let me, I can help you. Get you somewhere safe, somewhere warm." Jack looked away, staring at the trees. "We don't need a home." Mark exhaled slowly. "Maybe not, but you need more than this." Jack didn't respond. Mark could see the battle going on inside him, the part of him that wanted to accept help, and the part that had been taught not to trust anyone. Finally, Jack let out a quiet breath. "Can you bring more blankets?" Mark nodded. "Yeah, I can do that." Jack didn't say thank you, but he didn't have to. The fact that he'd asked meant something. Mark stood up, dusting off his jeans. "I'll be back tomorrow." Jack nodded, and for the first time, he didn't look quite so guarded. Buddy wagged his tail as Mark turned to leave, following him a few steps before stopping. The dog had done his job, looking after those kids for who knew how long. Now, Mark was going to do his part, because no one should be left out in the cold. Not when he could do something about it. Mark spent the next morning gathering supplies. He stopped by the hardware store to pick up a thicker tarp, knowing the kids' shelter wouldn't hold up much longer if the weather got worse. Then he swung by the grocery store, grabbing more non-perishable food: canned soup, peanut butter, bread, and some fruit. He added a couple of protein bars, figuring Jack would appreciate something filling. Finally, he stopped at his place and dug through his closet, pulling out a few more blankets and an old winter coat that might fit Jack. By the time he arrived at the woods, Buddy was already waiting, pacing near the tree line like he'd been anticipating Mark's arrival. The dog let out a short bark before trotting toward the clearing. Mark followed, feeling the chill in the air settle deeper into his skin. The kids needed more than just supplies. They needed real shelter, real warmth. He couldn't keep bringing them things forever. Jack was sitting outside the shelter again when Mark arrived, his arms wrapped around his knees. He looked up, his face unreadable. Emily was still curled inside the shelter, Lily pressed against her, both of them wrapped in the blankets Mark had given them the night before. They looked a little better, but it still wasn't enough. Mark set the bag down in front of Jack. "Got more food, some better blankets, and a tarp." Jack nodded, reaching for the bag. "Thanks." Mark crouched down beside him, watching as he pulled out a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter. Emily stirred, her eyes flickering open as she caught the smell of food. Lily shifted in her sleep, but didn't wake. "Been thinking," Mark said after a moment, rubbing his hands together. "You can't stay out here much longer. It's getting colder." Jack stiffened, but didn't say anything. Mark sighed. "I get it. You don't want to go anywhere you don't trust. But what if I found you something better than this? Something safe? Somewhere you can stay together?" Jack's jaw clenched. "Like what?" Mark exhaled. He'd been trying to figure that out himself. If he called child services, there was no guarantee they'd be kept together. But there had to be another way. "I got a place," Mark said finally. "It's not much, but there's heat, a roof. You wouldn't have to stay forever, just until we figure something out." Jack hesitated. "Why are you doing this?" Mark met his gaze. "Because no one helped me when I needed it, and I don't want that to happen to you." Jack looked away, staring at the trees. His fingers tightened around the bread in his hands. "We don't need a home." "I'm not offering you a home," Mark said gently. "I'm offering you a place to get warm, to eat without worrying where your next meal's coming from. Just for now." Jack was silent for a long time. Finally, he glanced at Emily. She was watching him, waiting for him to decide. Lily stirred slightly, still half asleep. Jack let out a slow breath. "Just for now," Mark nodded. "Just for now." Jack swallowed. Then, after another long pause, he gave the smallest nod. Mark stood up, trying not to let the relief show on his face. "All right, let's get you out of the cold." Mark had expected some resistance when he brought up leaving the woods, but he hadn't expected Jack's quiet acceptance. It wasn't relief exactly, more like exhaustion. The kind that settled into your bones after carrying too much weight for too long. Jack had been holding it together for so long. And now, maybe just for a little while, he didn't have to. Mark took a step back, giving Jack a moment to process. Emily had inched closer to her brother, eyes darting between him and Mark, waiting for direction. Lily was still half asleep, her head resting against Buddy, small fingers curled into the dog's fur. Mark could see it now, how much they'd relied on Buddy not just for food, but for comfort. That dog had been their protector, their warmth when the nights got too cold, their only source of safety when the world had failed them. Jack finally let out a slow breath. "Where?" "My place. Got an extra room, enough space for all of you. It's not fancy, but it's warm." Jack's fingers tightened in the fabric of his hoodie. "And then what?" Mark crouched down so they were eye level. "Then we figure it out." Jack didn't answer right away, but the fact that he wasn't rejecting the idea outright was a start. He glanced at Emily, who bit her lip, then at Lily, who was too young to understand what was happening. Finally, he nodded. "Okay. Just for now." Mark stood up and exhaled. "All right, pack up whatever you want to bring." Jack didn't have much. A couple of tattered blankets, an old stuffed rabbit that Emily clung to, and whatever bits of food they hadn't eaten yet. It didn't take long to gather their things, and soon Mark was leading them back toward town, Buddy trotting beside them, never straying too far from the kids. The walk wasn't long, but the air was colder now, and Mark could see the way Jack hunched his shoulders, the way Emily clung to his hand. He kept the pace steady, not too fast, not too slow, letting them feel in control even though they were stepping into the unknown. When they reached Mark's house, a small, one-story place with a porch that needed fixing, Jack stopped just outside the door. Mark could see the hesitation, the fear of stepping into something unfamiliar. "You don't have to stay," Mark said gently. "But at least come in and get warm." Jack nodded stiffly, and Mark opened the door, stepping aside to let them in first. Emily tugged on Jack's sleeve, and he gave her a small nod before they stepped inside. The house was simple, lived in. The living room had an old couch and a coffee table cluttered with newspapers and a couple of empty mugs. The kitchen was small, but clean, the scent of coffee still lingering from that morning. "Bathroom's down the hall. Extra blankets in the closet," Mark said, closing the door behind them. "You guys can take the spare room." Jack didn't move right away. eyes scanning the space like he was looking for a trap. Emily, on the other hand, was already pulling Lily toward the couch, the warmth of the house finally sinking in. Buddy jumped up next to them, settling in like he belonged there. Mark watched Jack for a moment before stepping into the kitchen. "You hungry?" Jack hesitated, then nodded. Mark pulled out a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter. Simple, but filling. He made sandwiches while Jack stood near the counter, still wary, still waiting for something to go wrong. He handed Jack a plate. "Emily and Lily, too." Jack took it carefully, bringing it over to the couch where his sisters were waiting. He sat down next to them, letting them eat first. Mark leaned against the counter, watching without making it obvious. For a long time, no one spoke. The only sound was the occasional crunch of bread, the soft hum of the heater kicking on. Then Emily looked up. "Is it really okay for us to stay here?" Mark met her gaze. "Yeah, kid, it's okay." She looked at Jack for confirmation. He didn't say anything, just gave a small nod. That was enough. The night passed quietly. Mark had expected some restlessness, maybe even a moment where Jack would change his mind and take his sisters back out into the cold. But the kids stayed. Lily fell asleep first, curled up against Buddy on the couch, her little fingers still gripping his fur. Emily wasn't far behind, her head resting on a pillow Mark had grabbed from the spare room. Jack stayed awake the longest, his body tense even as exhaustion pulled at him. Mark didn't press him. Instead, he sat in his recliner, flipping through the channels on the TV at low volume, letting the noise fill the silence between them. Eventually, Jack's head dipped slightly, his eyelids drooping. He fought it, but sleep won in the end. By the time morning came, Mark was already up, making coffee in the kitchen. He kept things quiet, not wanting to wake the kids too soon. The sun had barely started rising, casting a soft orange glow through the window. He heard movement behind him. Turning, he saw Jack standing in the hallway, rubbing his eyes. "Mornin'," Mark said, keeping his voice even. Jack looked around, like he was trying to remind himself where he was. "What time is it?" "Early. You sleep all right?" Jack shrugged. "Guess." Mark poured an extra mug of coffee and set it on the counter. "You take sugar?" Jack hesitated before nodding. Mark slid the sugar closer and let Jack fix it the way he wanted. He took a careful sip, his hands curling around the warmth of the mug. They stood in silence for a while, the only sound being the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall. Then Jack finally spoke. "What now?" Mark took a slow breath. "That's up to you. You can stay here as long as you need, but I think we need to figure out a real plan." Jack tensed. "We don't need anyone else." "Not saying you do," Mark said carefully. "But you gotta think about Emily and Lily. They need more than just surviving." Jack didn't answer, but Mark could see the struggle on his face. He wanted to protect his sisters, but he also didn't know how much longer he could keep doing it alone. Mark took another sip of coffee before continuing. "I know someone who might be able to help. A friend of mine, Sarah, runs a place for kids who don't have anywhere else to go. It's not like foster care or anything, it's more like a safe house. No one gets split up." Jack's eyes narrowed. "She gonna call the cops?" "Not unless you're in danger," Mark said. "Her whole thing is making sure kids don't end up lost in the system. She helps families stay together." Jack looked down at his coffee, silent. Mark let him think. He knew pushing wouldn't help. Jack had spent too much time being on guard. Trust wasn't something that came easy. After a long moment, Jack finally exhaled. "Can I meet her first?" Mark nodded. "Yeah, we'll take it slow." Jack didn't say anything else, but he gave the smallest nod. That was enough for now. The sound of small footsteps interrupted them. Emily appeared in the hallway, rubbing her eyes, followed closely by Buddy, who trotted up and sat at Jack's feet. Emily blinked up at them. "Is there breakfast?" Mark smiled. "Yeah, kid, there's breakfast." Mark got to work, pulling out eggs and bread from the fridge. He figured something warm would help ease the morning tension. As he cracked the eggs into a pan, Jack leaned against the counter, still watching him carefully, as if trying to decide whether or not to fully trust him. Emily climbed onto one of the kitchen stools, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, while Buddy sat beside her, thumping his tail against the floor. "I used to make breakfast for my little sister when I was your age," Mark said, keeping his tone light. "We didn't have much, but I learned how to scramble eggs before I could even ride a bike." Emily tilted her head. "You have a sister?" "Had," Mark corrected. "She passed a long time ago." Jack shifted slightly, as if considering whether to ask more, but he stayed silent. Mark didn't expect him to open up, not yet, so he let the quiet settle. Instead, he focused on making the eggs just right, toasting the bread until it was golden, and pouring milk into cups for the kids. When he finally set the plates in front of them, Emily's face brightened just a little. "This looks good," she murmured, picking up her fork. Jack took a few bites, still guarded but clearly hungry. Lily, once fully awake, dug in happily, making a mess of her plate but not caring one bit. Buddy watched with hopeful eyes, waiting for crumbs to fall. As they ate, Mark sat across from them, sipping his coffee. "You guys ever go to school?" Jack stiffened slightly. "We used to." "Before?" "Before everything," Jack said, voice clipped. Mark nodded, not pushing. "Well, if you ever wanted to go back, I could help with that." Jack frowned. "Why do you care so much?" Mark exhaled, setting his cup down. "Because someone helped me when I was in a bad spot, and because no kid should have to figure out the world alone." Jack didn't respond right away. He just kept eating, but Mark could see the wheels turning in his head. "Sarah's not like other people," Mark continued after a beat. "She doesn't force anything. She just helps." Jack hesitated, then nodded once. "Okay, we'll meet her." Mark took that as a victory. "All right, we'll head over later today. No rush." Jack glanced at his sisters. Emily was wiping her mouth with the back of her sleeve, and Lily was happily feeding the last of her toast to Buddy. The sight of them safe and fed seemed to ease something in him. Just a little. Mark stood, stretching. "I've got a couple errands to run before we go. You all are welcome to just hang out here." Jack's expression darkened slightly, as if expecting to be left behind. "You're coming back, right?" Mark met his eyes. "Yeah, kid. I'm coming back." Jack held his gaze for a long moment before finally nodding. That was enough for now. Mark made pancakes. It was the easiest thing he could think of that might feel like home without pushing too hard. He wasn't sure when the last time Jack, Emily, or Lily had a warm breakfast was, but when the smell filled the kitchen, he saw something shift in them. Emily perked up, watching him work, and even Jack seemed less guarded as he leaned against the counter, still holding his coffee mug. Lily was the first to take a seat at the table, her little fingers drumming against the wood as Buddy sat next to her like a loyal guard. Mark slid a plate in front of her, then set another in front of Emily. Jack hesitated before sitting, eyeing the food carefully before finally picking up his fork. They ate in silence at first. Mark let them settle into it, not trying to force conversation. He knew they weren't used to this, to safety, to sitting at a table and eating like they didn't have to worry about where their next meal would come from. It wasn't something that could be fixed overnight. Emily was the first to speak. "Do you always make pancakes?" Mark smiled. "Only when I've got company." She grinned a little at that, taking another bite. Lily, too young to care about anything but food, stuffed a big piece into her mouth and beamed. Jack, however, was still cautious. He ate, but he was thinking. Mark could see it. Finally, after another long pause, Jack set his fork down. "That lady, Sarah. When can we meet her?" Mark took a sip of coffee, nodding slightly. "Whenever you're ready. She's not far, just runs a small place out of town. No pressure, though. You don't have to do anything today." Jack looked down at his plate, thinking. "Tomorrow?" Mark nodded. "Tomorrow works." Emily glanced between them. "Who's Sarah?" Mark met her gaze. "She helps kids when they don't have anywhere else to go. Makes sure they're safe." Emily processed that, chewing slowly. "Is she nice?" "Yeah," Mark said. "She's nice, and she doesn't make anyone do anything they don't want to." That seemed to ease Emily's nerves. She nodded and went back to her pancakes. Jack, however, was still thinking. Mark leaned back in his chair. "You nervous?" Jack hesitated before answering. "I just don't want anyone taking us away." "That's not gonna happen," Mark assured him. "Not if I can help it." Jack held his gaze, looking for any sign that Mark was lying. Finally, he gave a small nod. "Okay, tomorrow." Mark didn't push any further. He let them finish breakfast, let them settle. Jack was willing to take the next step, and that was enough for now. As the morning stretched on, Mark realized something. The house, usually too quiet, didn't feel so empty anymore. For the first time in a long time, it felt like someone belonged there. After breakfast, Mark took the dishes to the sink, rinsing them as Emily wandered into the living room. She found an old book on a shelf and flipped through it, occasionally glancing up at Buddy as if she were reading to him. Lily climbed up onto the couch, curling up with her stuffed rabbit, her tiny fingers tracing over the worn fabric. Jack, meanwhile, stayed in the kitchen, watching Mark work. "Do you work every day?" Jack finally asked, his voice quieter than before. Mark turned off the faucet and dried his hands. "Most days, yeah. The shop's not too busy, though. Gives me time to handle things when I need to." Jack nodded, considering something. "What did you do before?" Mark hesitated. "Before the shop, had a couple jobs. Worked construction for a bit, did some delivery work. But the shop was always my dad's, so when he retired, I took over." Jack didn't say anything right away. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table. "Did you always have a home?" Mark exhaled. "Not always. Had a rough patch when I was younger, after my mom passed. My dad and I, well, we didn't get along. I left when I was about your age." Jack's brow furrowed. "Where'd you go?" "Different places. Stayed with a friend for a while, then found work, scraped by. Took a long time to figure things out." Jack looked down at his hands. "We had a home before everything happened." Mark didn't push. He let the silence settle, waiting to see if Jack wanted to say more. After a moment, Jack clenched his fists and looked up. "I just want to make sure Emily and Lily are okay. That's all that matters." Mark nodded. "I know, kid. And you've done a damn good job. But you don't have to do it alone anymore." Jack didn't respond, but something in his expression softened. He wasn't ready to accept help completely, but he wasn't fighting against it either. That was enough for now. Later in the afternoon, Mark stepped outside to take a call. Sarah's voice came through the line, calm and steady. You said you found 3 kids? Yeah. 2 girls, 1 boy. The boy's the oldest, maybe 13. He's been taking care of them, but they were living in the woods before I found them. Sarah sighed. That's tough. But if they're open to it, I can make space for them. Jack's cautious. He doesn't trust easily, but he agreed to meet you. That's a start. Bring them by tomorrow. No pressure, just a conversation. Mark thanked her and ended the call, stepping back inside. Jack was sitting with Emily and Lily, the 3 of them curled up together on the couch as Buddy lay at their feet. The sight of them there, safe for the moment, made Mark's resolve even stronger. Tomorrow, they'd take another step forward, and no matter what happened, he wasn't going to let them face it alone. The day passed in quiet routines. After breakfast, Mark set about cleaning up while Emily and Lily sat on the couch, watching Buddy chew on an old toy he'd found somewhere. Jack helped with the dishes without being asked, and Mark let him, recognizing the way the boy needed to feel useful. The kids were adjusting, but Mark could tell it wasn't easy. They weren't used to being inside, weren't used to safety that didn't come with a catch. Emily kept glancing toward the door, like she was making sure it wasn't locked. Jack stayed close to his sisters, never letting them out of his sight for too long. Even Lily, as carefree as she seemed, clung to Buddy's fur like an anchor. Mark didn't push them. Instead, he gave them space to settle, to exist without expectation. He spent the afternoon working around the house, fixing a loose board on the porch and straightening up the spare room in case they wanted to sleep there instead of the couch. Every so often, he'd catch Emily watching him, her curiosity outweighing her caution. By evening, the house felt different. Not quite home, not yet, but something close to it. Mark made dinner. Nothing fancy, just grilled cheese and soup, but it was warm, and the kids ate without hesitation. Afterward, Emily found an old deck of cards in a drawer and asked if they could play. Mark agreed, teaching them a simple game, letting the tension ease for just a little while. Jack didn't join in at first, but eventually he sat down at the table, watching. Mark slid the deck toward him. Want a deal? Jack hesitated before nodding. He shuffled the cards, slower than necessary, like he was testing whether it was okay to enjoy this moment. Mark let him take his time. They played until Lily started yawning, and Emily's head drooped against the table. Jack looked at them, then at Mark. Where should they sleep? Mark gestured toward the spare room. Up to you. Couch is fine if that's what you want, but there's a bed in there if they're more comfortable. Jack seemed to weigh the options before finally nodding. I'll take them. Mark stood up, stretching. I'll get some extra blankets. Jack helped Emily and Lily into the room, and Buddy followed, curling up on the floor beside the bed. Mark handed Jack an extra blanket, watching as the boy tucked it around his sisters with a kind of quiet care that spoke volumes. For the first time since meeting them, Mark saw something in Jack's face that wasn't just worry or exhaustion. It was something close to hope. Jack looked at Mark as he stepped toward the door. Tomorrow, we meet Sarah. Mark nodded. Yeah, tomorrow. Jack gave one last glance at his sisters before shutting off the light. Mark walked back to the living room, rubbing a hand over his face. This wasn't the end of the road, not by a long shot. But for tonight, they were safe. And that was enough. The next morning, the house was quiet when Mark woke up. He moved carefully, not wanting to wake the kids too soon. He brewed a pot of coffee, leaning against the counter as he let his thoughts settle. Today was a big step. Meeting Sarah meant stepping outside of what Jack could control, and Mark knew the kid wasn't thrilled about that. He glanced toward the hallway just in time to see Jack emerge, rubbing sleep from his eyes. The boy paused, as if remembering where he was, then walked into the kitchen. "Mornin'," Mark greeted. Jack nodded, glancing around. "Emily and Lily are still asleep." "That's all right. We've got time." Jack slid onto one of the kitchen chairs, watching as Mark poured a second cup of coffee and placed it in front of him. He didn't reach for it right away. Instead, he sat there, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. "You sure about this?" Jack asked after a moment. Mark leaned on the counter, crossing his arms. "Meeting Sarah?" "Yeah. But you don't have to decide anything today. Just talk to her. See what you think." Jack exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face. "I don't want them to be scared." "I know." Mark sat down across from him. "You've done everything you can for them. This isn't about taking that away. It's about making sure they're okay." Jack stayed quiet, staring at the table. After a long moment, he nodded. Later that morning, Emily and Lily woke up, and Mark made a quick breakfast of toast and scrambled eggs. Emily asked a few more questions about Sarah, her nerves bubbling up the closer they got to leaving. Mark kept his answers steady, honest, reassuring her that nothing was being forced. When it was finally time to go, Jack helped Emily and Lily put on their jackets. Buddy, sensing the shift in routine, stuck close to the kids as they stepped outside. The air was crisp, the sky pale blue. Mark led them to his truck, opening the passenger side door. "Hop in." Jack hesitated, then helped Emily and Lily into the truck before climbing in himself. Mark started the engine, glancing at the three of them before pulling out of the driveway. The drive was quiet. Emily stared out the window, her fingers playing with the hem of her sleeve. Lily leaned against Jack, her small hands tucked into her pockets. Jack sat stiffly, eyes fixed ahead. Sarah's place wasn't far, just a 15-minute drive out of town. When they arrived, Mark parked in front of a modest 2-story house with a wraparound porch. The place was welcoming, with potted plants lining the steps and a couple of kids playing in the yard. Jack eyed the house warily. "This is it?" "Yeah," Mark said. "Sarah keeps things small. No big buildings, no institutions. Just a place where kids can be safe." The front door opened, and Sarah stepped out, wiping her hands on a towel. She was in her 40s, with sharp eyes but a gentle smile. She walked toward the truck, stopping a few feet away. "Mark," she greeted, then looked at the kids. "You must be Jack, Emily, and Lily." Jack gave a small nod, but didn't move. Emily peeked at Sarah, then quickly looked away. Lily gripped Jack's sleeve. Sarah knelt down slightly, making herself smaller. "I know this is a lot. I won't make you come inside if you don't want to. But if you do, I've got hot chocolate on the stove and some warm blankets by the fireplace." Emily shifted slightly at that. Jack looked at her, then at Lily, before finally meeting Mark's gaze. Mark didn't say anything, just gave him a small nod. Jack let out a breath, then reached for the truck door. One step at a time. Jack climbed out of the truck first, his movements stiff but deliberate. He kept close to Emily and Lily, who hesitated before stepping down. Lily reached for Jack's hand, clutching it tightly. Emily lingered behind, her eyes darting between Sarah and the front porch. Buddy hopped out last, shaking himself before padding toward the group, standing protectively beside the kids. Sarah didn't push. She simply smiled, giving them space. "Come on inside when you're ready," she said before turning back toward the house, leaving the door open behind her. Jack exchanged a glance with Emily, then looked at Mark. "You coming?" Mark nodded. Yeah. That was enough for Jack to take the first step. He led Emily and Lily up the porch steps, Buddy right behind them. Mark followed at a short distance, watching as they crossed the threshold. The house was warm, the scent of cinnamon and coffee drifting through the air. A fireplace crackled in the living room, casting a soft glow over the space. Sarah reappeared from the kitchen, carrying a tray with 4 mugs of hot chocolate. Figured you might like something warm. Emily hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. She took a mug carefully, the steam rising in delicate swirls. Lily watched her before taking her own. Jack was the last to accept, his fingers curling around the ceramic as he held it close. Mark took a seat on the couch, gesturing for the kids to sit too. They settled into the chairs across from him, Buddy laying at their feet. Jack sat upright, shoulders squared, still waiting for something to go wrong. Sarah sat across from them, her hands wrapped around her own mug. I know Mark probably told you a little about me, but I want you to know I'm not here to make any decisions for you. This isn't a foster home, and no one's going to take you away from each other. Jack didn't respond right away, but Mark could see the tension in his body ease slightly. Sarah continued, What I do is help kids who don't have anywhere else to go. Some stay for a little while, some stay longer. No one's forced to do anything. We just make sure you're safe, warm, and have what you need. Emily sipped her hot chocolate. So, we could stay together? Sarah nodded. Absolutely. That's the most important thing. Jack frowned, his fingers tapping against the side of his mug. What's the catch? No catch, Sarah said gently. Just a safe place if you want it. Jack let out a slow breath, thinking. Mark didn't interrupt. He knew this was a big decision, one Jack needed to make on his own. Lily yawned, rubbing her eyes. Sarah smiled. You guys had a long morning. If you want, you can take a look around, see if this feels right for you. Jack hesitated, then glanced at Emily, who nodded. Okay. Sarah stood. Come on, I'll show you around. Mark stayed on the couch as the kids followed Sarah down the hall. Buddy trotted after them, his tail wagging slightly. Mark listened to their footsteps as they moved through the house. Sarah's voice soft as she explained the different rooms. A few minutes later, Jack returned to the living room alone. He looked at Mark, uncertainty flickering in his expression. You really think this is a good idea? Mark met his gaze. I think it's your call, but yeah, I do. Jack crossed his arms, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Feels weird, like we don't belong. Mark leaned forward. Jack, you've been looking out for your sisters for a long time. You've done everything right, but you don't have to do it alone anymore. Jack clenched his jaw. I just don't want them to get hurt again. Mark nodded. Neither do I. That's why I think this place could help. You don't have to decide right now, but maybe give it a chance. Jack exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. I don't know. That's okay, Mark said. Just take it one step at a time. Jack was quiet for a moment, then nodded. All right, we'll stay for a little while. See how it goes. Mark felt a quiet relief settle over him. That's all anyone's asking. Jack turned back toward the hallway, where Emily and Lily's voices drifted in soft laughter. For the first time in a long time, they had a place where they could just be kids. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. Sarah returned a few moments later, taking a seat across from Mark. He's a tough kid. Mark nodded. He had to be. Sarah leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. I'll let them take their time. No pressure. They can stay in the guest room for as long as they need before deciding if they want to be here. Mark ran a hand through his hair. Appreciate that. Jack's carrying a lot on his shoulders. I can see that. Sarah studied Mark for a moment. And you? What's your plan? Mark let out a quiet chuckle. Haven't thought that far ahead. Just want to make sure they're okay. Sarah smiled. You're a good man, Mark. Most people wouldn't have done what you did. Mark shrugged. Just doing what I can. Sarah glanced toward the hallway where the kids had disappeared. I'll keep you updated on how they settle in. If they want to stay, I can make arrangements. If not, they always have a place with me, Mark finished. Sarah nodded. I figured. The two sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Mark listened to the faint sounds of Emily talking to Lily, the occasional bark from Buddy as he explored the house. It felt right. Jack eventually reappeared, his expression unreadable. He stood near the doorway, hands in his pockets. Emily likes it here, so does Lily. Mark nodded. And you? Jack hesitated, then exhaled. I think we can try it. Just for now. Mark smiled. That's all you need to do. Jack gave a small nod, then turned back toward the hallway. Sarah stood, stretching. They'll be okay, Mark. I'll take care of them. Mark exhaled, the weight of responsibility easing just a little. I know you will. Sarah gave him a reassuring look before heading down the hall. Mark stayed on the couch, listening to the sounds of the house, sounds of something new, something safe. For the first time in a long time, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. Jack stepped out of the truck first, holding the door open for Emily and Lily. They hesitated, their hands tightening in his, but he gave them a small nod. Buddy leaped out beside them, his tail wagging as he looked toward the house, sensing something warm and welcoming beyond the front door. The soft hum of laughter and distant chatter carried through the crisp morning air. Sarah didn't move toward them, giving them space. She just waited, offering a reassuring smile. Take your time. Jack exhaled, glancing at Mark one last time. Mark met his gaze, steady and calm. No rush. Jack finally took a step forward. Emily followed, still clinging to his side, while Lily's eyes flickered between the house and Buddy. Slowly they made their way up the steps, the wooden boards creaking slightly beneath their feet. Jack hovered near the door, not quite ready to cross the threshold. Sarah opened it wider. It's warm inside. You can come in just for a little bit, even if you don't stay. Lily was the first to move. She let go of Jack's hand and stepped past him, drawn in by the smell of something sweet in the air. Emily hesitated before following. Jack remained frozen, his hands clenched at his sides. His instincts told him to run, but his sisters were already inside. Mark placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. I'll be right here. Jack swallowed hard, then nodded. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. The house was warm, not just in temperature, but in atmosphere. A fire crackled in the fireplace, and soft rugs covered the wooden floors. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and a couple of kids sat curled up on a couch, flipping through pages of a story. A long dining table was set in the next room, plates stacked neatly on one end, as if always ready for a meal. Lily had already found her way to a plush armchair, kicking off her shoes and curling up with Buddy, who happily plopped down beside her. Emily stood closer to the entrance, watching Sarah cautiously. Jack remained near the door, his back straight, his eyes sharp, still waiting for something to go wrong. Sarah gestured toward the kitchen. Want some hot chocolate? Emily nodded first. Jack glanced at her, then at Lily, who had already made herself comfortable. "Okay," he muttered. Sarah led them into the kitchen, where a kettle was already steaming. She poured hot chocolate into mugs, sliding them across the counter. Jack took his carefully, still watching Sarah like she might suddenly change the rules. "We take things slow here," Sarah said, leaning against the counter. "You're not expected to decide anything today. This is just a place to breathe." Jack studied her, then took a sip of his drink. He didn't respond, but he didn't push back either. That was progress. Mark sat on a stool near the counter, letting Jack and the girls take it all in. He had known Sarah for years, had seen the way she helped kids who had nowhere else to go. She had a way of making them feel safe, without them even realizing it. After a few minutes, Sarah set her mug down. "You've been doing a good job, Jack. I can see how much you've looked after them." Jack flinched slightly, caught off guard by the words. He set his mug down, rubbing his fingers against the rim. "They're my responsibility." "I know," Sarah said. "And you've done more for them than most adults would have. But you don't have to carry everything alone." Jack tensed, looking down. He didn't know how to accept that yet. Sarah let the silence sit before speaking again. "How about this? You stay for a couple of nights. Just see how it feels. No commitment." Jack's eyes darted to Emily and Lily. Emily was still quiet, but less tense. Lily was already laughing at something Buddy was doing. Jack exhaled, considering. Mark leaned forward slightly. "You don't have to decide now, but maybe it wouldn't be so bad to rest for a little while." Jack nodded slowly. "Just a couple of nights." Sarah smiled. "That sounds like a good start." The afternoon passed in small moments of adjustment. Emily and Lily explored the house, gravitating toward a bookshelf full of old fairy tales. Jack remained near the kitchen, keeping a watchful eye on everything. He didn't speak much, but he didn't leave either. Mark knew that was a sign he was still deciding. As the day turned to evening, Sarah set the table for dinner. She placed an extra 3 plates down without a word, giving Jack the choice. He watched for a moment, then guided Emily and Lily to their seats. Mark took a seat nearby, feeling a strange kind of peace settle over him. He had spent weeks wondering how to help these kids, wondering what their future would look like. Tonight, for the first time, he had an answer. They weren't lost anymore. They weren't alone. Jack looked at Mark before picking up his fork. "You staying for dinner?" Mark smiled. "Yeah, kid, I'm staying." And for the first time, Jack smiled back. After dinner, Sarah showed Jack and the girls to a cozy guest room with 2 beds pushed together. Jack helped Emily and Lily settle in, making sure they had everything they needed before sitting on the edge of the bed himself. He wasn't used to this. Warm beds, full stomachs, and a house that didn't feel like it had expectations tied to it. Mark knocked softly on the doorframe. "You doing okay?" Jack looked up, then nodded. "Yeah." Mark leaned against the doorway. "You know, I had someone help me once. I was about your age, thought I had to handle everything on my own. I was wrong." Jack looked down at his hands. "It's just hard to believe we don't have to run anymore." "I get that," Mark said. "But you don't. You can stay. You can just be." Jack took a deep breath, then glanced at Emily and Lily, who were already drifting off. He nodded. "Okay." Mark smiled. "Get some rest, kid." Jack hesitated, then muttered, "Thanks." Mark didn't respond, just gave him a small nod before closing the door halfway. As he walked down the hallway, Sarah appeared beside him. You did good, Mark. Mark exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I hope so. Sarah patted his arm. You gave them a chance to stop running. That's more than enough. Mark glanced toward the closed door one last time, then nodded. Yeah, it is. For the first time in a long time, he felt like everything had turned out exactly as it should be. That night, Mark stayed at Sarah's house for a while longer, talking with her about what came next. There were legal steps, papers to sort through, but nothing had to happen immediately. What mattered most was that the kids felt safe. Before leaving, he peeked in on them one last time. Jack was still awake, staring at the ceiling, while Emily and Lily slept soundly. Buddy lay curled up at their feet, his ears twitching slightly. Jack turned his head slightly, noticing Mark standing in the doorway. He didn't say anything, but he didn't look away either. Mark gave him a nod. See you tomorrow, kid. For the first time, Jack didn't tense at those words. He just nodded back, and for Mark, that was enough.